Hello, dear friends and adventurers. It's Rob, the D&D wannabe, here with some exciting news. This podcast is now made possible in partnership with our good friends at Misty Mountain Gaming. Veteran-owned and operated, Misty Mountain is one of the largest dice companies in the world. They offer the widest selection of metal, gemstone, and glass dice combined. For yourself, that special role player in your life, or your favorite podcast hosts. Just saying. Look for their booth at your next local comic, anime, or gaming convention, or find their products at mistymountaingaming.com. Okay, on with the show.
Thank you, cousins, for gathering here today. As your sovereign deity, it is good to see you all here. I see the faces of some new gods amongst the crowd, as the divine domains have gotten a lot more specific this millennia. I look forward to getting to know you all better. And before we get down to business, let's go ahead and determine who is in attendance. Goddess of Earth, Gaia, are you here?
Excuse me, sir. Pretentious here, god of pedants and corrections. Gaia is the goddess of nature. Terra is the goddess of earth. Just thought you might want to know.
I'm terribly sorry, Gaia. Terribly sorry, Terra. We're working on it. It's going to be a process, all right? I'll get it right, don't worry. All right. God of Magic. Murmur, yes, I see you. Thank you very much. God of Secrets. You can put your hand down, Murmur. I was asking for the God of Secrets. That's you. That's you as well. Okay. Oh, that makes things easier. I'll just fix my list here. And, God of Knowledge. God of Knowledge. Murmur as well. Well, all right then. I guess I've got some clarifying to do. Let's do it this way. Who do the mortals pray to for safe passage on their adventures? Me preserve us. Did 11 of them really just raise their hands? Pretentious! Come here! Explain this nonsense.
Well, you see, Janus is the god of safe passage over land, and Olmo is the god of safe passage over the seas. Zeus is, of course, the god of storms, which, of course, you don't want when you're traveling. Then there's the god of horses, and the god of ships, and there's the god of the wilderness, the god of civilization. There's, of course, the god of keeping a pebble from getting stuck in your boot as you walk, or you could pray for protection from the fiendish Oregon Terrails, the god of dying of dysentery.
All right, fine. Forget the roll call. I called you all here because we need to address a problem with the water cycle. Someone hasn't been holding up their end of the deal. I must speak to the god of waters immediately.
Of course. Inland or oceanic?
What? I don't know. Inland, I suppose.
Right. So rivers, lakes, rain, or just puddles on the road.
We have a god of puddles in the road?
Oh, at least 6. Or the god of the sea foam that's still in the beach between the waves.
All right, enough!
Oh boy, temper tantrum. Hello.
This is getting out of hand. How are we supposed to get anything done if we don't know who's in charge of anything? I don't know who to assign stuff to anymore. Heavens, I've never even seen most of these people. I mean, this guy, Pretentious, who is this one here? Who is this god?
That would be your Anus, a god of silly names and potty humor.
Don't you mean Uranus?
No, would name a god Uranus. That would be preposterous.
No. Preposterous doesn't get to name any more gods. I've already seen to that.
Posteriorus.
That's what I changed his name to after that whole incident, but that's beside the point. We have got to come up with some sort of system to make this easier to remember. If it's this bad for us, just imagine what it's like for the mortals. We can maybe group them together, make things easier to remember. Maybe have a principal god of the waters to preside over the other minor gods and keep them in line. Yes, that could work. We should get to work on that right away. Pretentious, I would like you to... Loki! Stop messing with your anus in front of everyone! It's very distracting! We're trying to make some progress here!
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Bardic Twinspiration. We ain't done yet. It's me, Rob, aka D&D Wannabe, co-host of this show.
And I'm Steven. Thank you so much for joining us again for yet another week. Today, we go back to the beginning, to the very inception of your homebrew campaign setting. We're going to be talking about the building blocks of the world that your story is going to take place in.
Or perhaps more specifically, the people playing with those blocks. We're going to be discussing gods, goddesses,
Divines, celestials,
demons, devils, archdevils,
fiends.
The people with power, the most power to affect your game world. Those that rule it, but are not necessarily a part of it, and who have varying levels of involvement, depending on the kind of campaign you're running, the kind of player characters your players are choosing to pilot, and the setting itself.
Very often, these will be the very first entities to lay their hands upon your world, and designing them is going to have some very big impacts on what the world looks like by the time the player characters are born, nay, begin their adventuring careers. So, I guess the first thing that we need to talk about is, does D&D require there to be gods in your campaign setting, homebrew or not?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the answer is pretty resoundingly so. I know that there are a lot of different games, a lot of different systems that allow for a whole bunch of different types of religions.
Yeah, you can play D&D any kind of way you want.
Yes, it is your campaign setting that you're building from scratch. We're not here to tell you what you can and can't do, but what we are here to tell you is that there are certain classes, I'm thinking right off the bat of paladins, clerics, and warlocks, and some subclasses, such as divine soul sorcerers, that imply or even narratively demand the existence of at least one higher power, some sort of extraplanar entity of unfathomable power, which it can grant to these player characters.
Right. The game assumes that you are going to have one or more gods in your campaign setting. There are magic items besides the classes and the subclasses that imply divinity, like the Holy Avenger, for instance. The Aasimar and Tieflings imply angels and devils to exist. Monsters like the angels, the Planetar, the Solar, the Deva, imply that they are servants of deities. Kuwatls are servants of deities. There's a host of demons and devils that are servants of the archdevils and the lords of the abyss.
The list goes on and on.
Yeah. Importantly, if you purchase the Dungeon Master's Guide, on page 9, the first few paragraphs of chapter 1 tells you the core assumptions that the book makes about your campaign setting. It says, feel free to make your own, darling, you do whatever you want to. Just know that the stuff that you're going to read about this game assumes certain things are going on. And number 1 on that list of core assumptions is gods oversee the world. It would take special exception and effort on the part of the Dungeon Master to remove this pretty fundamental element of the game.
Yep. You can absolutely write a homebrew setting that has absolutely no gods, and that all the power is drawn from within, or all the power is drawn from the ley lines that run underneath the ground, or from the nebulous entities of Force and midichlorians. But what we and the DMG are here to tell you is that you are going to have to do a lot of writing and rewriting in order to work around these assumptions upon which the game is built. So, in short, unless you're gearing up for that, yes, you're going to need some gods. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have a player character that was atheistic.
Sure.
Although, in a traditional setting, that's going to require a lot of disbelief on their part.
In the traditional D&D settings, there is just overwhelming evidence that the gods exist, and they act through their servants, the clerics and the paladins and the divine soul sorcerers and the Aasimar, and even their devout, who have no class levels in anything religious.
Yeah, it's really hard to be atheistic when the paladin can come through town, lay his hands on you, and cure you of the diseases which afflict you.
Right. So, yeah, D&D has gods.
Yeah. Play a character that doesn't like the gods, not one that denies them, because that would be hard.
Hey, I'm always up for a challenge, baby.
let's go ahead and talk about the quantity of gods that are affecting your campaign setting. How many is enough and how many is too many? Rob, let's get your just base opinion on this.
Okay, so when we get to our episodes on world building, which I'm really looking forward to, you'll find out that I really believe that simplicity often works best. If you want your players to engage with your world, with your pantheon, if you want these things to roll off their tongue during roleplay, you gotta keep it sweet and simple. So a short list would be what I would recommend.
So, more than one, but a number that a toddler could count to.
Yeah, I mean, when I first ran my original campaign, the very first campaign I ever ran, I had only 3. I had a god of order, I had a god of chaos, and I had a god who was a peacemaker between the two, who was a god of neutrality. And that was enough for me. And I actually came up with my entire creation mythos from just those 3 guys trying and failing to cooperate. And let me tell you, all my players in that campaign could rattle off those 3 names in a heartbeat.
Right.
As it was a short enough list that they could make it work. Nowadays, if you have a deity for each of those 14 divine domains, light, life, death, war, trickery, the sea, and storms, you're probably doing all right. You know, you've kind of got your bases covered.
That's good. I never really thought of it that way. That's a really great way to start. I have in my notes here that you should think about the domains of each of your gods and what kind of things they preside over, and the subclasses right away just give you a bunch of great options there. That's a really good point.
I think simple is good, especially for the Dungeon Master, because the Dungeon Master has to do a lot of things to get the campaign ready and to keep the campaign going. The simpler we can make it for the Dungeon Master, the better. Now, that's not to say 14 needs to be your stopping point, or that you can't expand the divine domains of one particular deity or another, but it really does kind of put a finish line to it. And the people designing the game have put a decent amount of thought into what broad strokes, what portfolios a reasonably complete pantheon might involve. So I would start there.
Right. I, too, am of the opinion that a manageable number is ideal. And I say that because, as a player, I have read the World Bible of every setting with which I have been involved. But some of those have had so many gods and goddesses in them that I could not remember the first one by the time I got to the 20th one. And I couldn't remember the 20th one by the time I got ready to read the 40th one. And by the end, I probably couldn't tell you anything about any of them. So if you want to keep these relevant to your players, you need to make it a number, like I said, a number a toddler can count to.
As a father of a toddler, what number would that be?
Ideally, I think that your number of gods should be between 1 and, say, 24. Like 1 or 2 dozen would be a number that gives you a good amount of breadth, a good amount of depth. You can divide up the domains pretty clearly, and yet it doesn't get so out of hand that your players have no hope of remembering. Obviously, Wizards of the Coast does not necessarily agree with this, because I went back and looked through, just so I could have some information on this, how many gods there were in the core campaign settings from previous editions.
That's a deep rabbit hole.
Yeah. Thank you, Wikipedia, for making this accessible to me. I was just absolutely floored, okay? Advanced D&D, that second edition, had 109 named gods. Mm-hmm. Third edition, between the 19 core gods that are in the PHB, there were 78 that appeared in other supplementary works and source books. There were 108 named deities in the forms of paragons, vestiges, archdevils, demon lords, etc. And this is not including the supplement that they provided called Deities and Demigods, which in and of itself had 4 distinct pantheons, 3 of which are independent from the ones that I have just named. Wow, 3rd edition, what a time to be alive. I couldn't even read the list. It would have taken me longer than it would have to record this episode. 4E, they made some changes. In 4th edition, they got to 20 currently presiding gods with 10 that were deceased or fallen from grace. And then in 5th edition, they increased it back up a little bit. The primary 5th edition setting is the Forgotten Realms, which has 42. Greyhawk has 28. I know virtually nothing about Dragonlance, but I really like the way that they broke it up. It's kind of similar to what you did. Instead of having the one lawful god, the one chaotic god, and one peacekeeping neutral god from your original campaign setting, they broke it up in a similar fashion. They have 7 lawful gods, 7 neutral gods, and 7 evil gods. And Eberron has 39. So I think that the lower you can get that number, the more your players will engage with it. If you give them one god, they're going to have it down. If you give them a dozen, then that's good. You want to give them some options, but it's really more about you and your world building than it is about giving the players choices.
I'm struggling to think of a campaign that I've run that has intimately involved more than 5 deities.
Right.
It's just like having more cities or more factions or more player characters. It's more world building. Sure, it adds depth to the story that you're telling, but is it really super relevant world building? Is it going to matter to the story that you're telling? Is it going to matter to your players? Unless you're playing a game with 20 players and they all picked clerics, maybe not.
Yeah, like, are their names even going to come up throughout the course of a traditional campaign? Like, much less are they going to be relevant to your story.
I mean, we're telling a story right now in our current campaign that has a lot to do with the gods. How many of my gods can you name?
I can name a few.
Yeah, I'm not expecting much because they haven't come up a lot in the game.
Yeah. No, they've actually not played into that at all. I can name several of them, but only because I specifically studied them to play a cleric in one of your one-shots.
There you go.
The lower you can get that number, the better, the more manageable it is. I mean, let's face it, the world's oldest standing religion does just fine with one god and a devil. You don't need more than that.
Just fine. It's still kicking.
Yeah.
Explained everything with just the 2 of those guys.
And you can further complicate and divide that up as much as you want into as many deities and domains and fiends as you feel inclined to do. But just know that, much like a lot of other aspects of campaign setting design, if you go too far, you'll be doing it for you, not for your players.
And, there's catharsis. There is creative merit in doing something for yourself. In fact, that's a lot of the reason why I built my Pantheon, is because I wanted to have a entity for people in certain situations of life that they felt like they could beseech and implore for their needs. I wanted a god for farmers and a god for hunters and a god for fishermen.
Right, you have a god for soldiers, you have a god for scholars, you have a god for beggars.
Yeah, and that was something that I wanted to do to make my world more interesting to me. My Pantheon is made available to my players. I don't think most of them have really taken the time to dig into it unless, like you did for my one-shot, you wanted to play a particularly faithful man.
Right. So I think that your focus when you are designing your campaign setting should be on the major deities. However many you decide to have, this is world building that you are doing for you and for your setting in order to shape the world that your players are going to interact with. But where major gods fail you, minor gods can step in. Then one of your players might come up to you and say, hey, I was thinking that I might be cleric of the god of dreams. I use this example because I think it came up to you when you were getting one of your campaigns ready.
Yeah, I've mentioned before my friend Ian, who got me into Dungeons & Dragons at all. He streams on Twitch now at the Hall of Justice. I run for him and one of his old high school friends, who was also a Twitch streamer. And they decided that they both wanted to play Kalashtar, however you want to say that. Dream people with dream spirits in their heads. And so they kind of wanted to know where they came from. And no one had wanted to play a Kalashtar in my world before. So I said, all right, let's knuckle down. Let's find out what Kalashtar are and where they come from and who presides over them. Because every people came from somewhere. And if they came from somewhere, it was probably a god, and that god probably feels responsible for them in some way. So it was not before then that I realized that I wanted a god of dreams. My players brought a need to my attention, and we cooperated on creating Whim.
So, question for you that's may or may not be related to the rest of this episode. When do you feel like you should accommodate your players in that way, and when do you feel like you should not, if at all? Because, adding a god to your world seems like a very significant gesture.
So, me personally, I indulge this stuff a lot. I have my Pantheon. My Pantheon is set, and no one is going to change it. That core list of major deities. But they don't cover everything, as clearly evidenced by my needing a god of dreams. I had a god of war, but I didn't have a god of the forge. And I had a mistress of magic, but not with the particular flavors that one of my player characters was after. They wanted to be a cleric of the god of magic, but my goddess of magic is not very nice, and they wanted to worship someone nice. So we had to create an aspect of the goddess of magic, or a child of the goddess of magic, to accommodate that player's desires, and to make it work. My Pantheon didn't change, but my world did a little bit. And that kind of collaborative storytelling doesn't bother me, because that's what we're here to do. We're here to play Dungeons & Dragons. We're here to tell a story together. If that kind of thing bothers you, you may be being a little precious with your world. In my opinion.
I am inclined to agree, because I feel that, again, D&D is a collaborative storytelling game, as you said. And, if you want to have complete and total control over it, then, go write a book. Which I am not discouraging you from doing.
Sounds a lot like go off. Go write a book!
No, go write a book. I'm not wanting to discourage anyone from doing that. World building is a wonderful and fun exercise in its own right. Then you can make it as detailed as you want. I only say the things that I'm saying in this episode because I want the listeners to understand, some of what you are doing in world building, if you make it gratuitously detailed, is largely going to be for your own benefit as the creator. But the game should not be entirely for your own benefit. And so allowing your players to have input is, while not necessary, I think that it pays very large dividends. And it is kind of integral to the theory of the D&D experience.
So let's pull some examples, maybe, before we get too much deeper into it. Pantheons exist in our own history as a human race, and we create our own for works of fantasy and fiction. Mm-hmm. What are some pantheons that spring to mind that others have created that would be good points of reference, good examples for people getting ready to create their own divine catalogs?
Well, where I'm going to go first. I really like the Pantheon from The Lord of the Rings. And, but Steve, the Pantheon from The Lord of the Rings, there's no Pantheon mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. Well, you really kind of have to read the Silmarillion to really dig into that. And it's the majority of what the Silmarillion is about. The first and second ages are about the children of Iluvatar in the form of the Valar and the other Maya, which they're kind of similar to Norse gods like the Aesir, or a lot of people have compared them to angels, but they are effectively the gods and goddesses of Middle-earth. Mm-hmm. There are 15 of them if you include the embodiment of all that is evil in the world. They are all created by the singular creator deity, the one who actually represents the truest form of God, which is Iluvatar. He barely interacts with the story after chapter 1. He creates this world and he gives it to his children to cultivate for more children yet to come in the form of men and elves. And it is up to them to shape the world, and they all have their particular domains and personalities which help them to do so. But I really like the idea of having one all-powerful creator god that was not particularly involved, and then on the flip side you have several deities of lesser power who are incredibly involved in the forming of the world. I think that works really well for D&D.
Yeah, Iluvatar being this incredibly omniscient, omnipotent entity who created people to manage existence for him and then kicking back on the lazy boy is relatable. And then handing over creation to all of his children, and then them kind of taking a backseat too as time goes on. You know the story better than me. My impression was they kind of just became disinterested. Like, playing with Middle-earth wasn't fun anymore.
I kind of had to refresh myself on it today because it's been an embarrassing long time since I've interacted with Tolkien's works, when it used to be practically all that I read. But essentially, Iluvatar created the world with the help of the Valar and the other Maya, and then he gave it to them. And very importantly, he instilled them with purpose. He gave them the instructions, like, I'm going to eventually create men and elves, and it is your job to get this place ready for them. And then they did all sorts of stuff. They arranged the mountains, they grew the forests, they dug the rivers, and, filled the seas and things like that. And they did all this with the opposition of Melkor, who was by far the most powerful of them, who only wanted to ruin what Iluvatar had started, because he could not create, he could only change, he could only mar. So they eventually pulled out when he brought the fight to them. He went to the Isles where they lived and destroyed things there. And so they eventually pulled out and regrettably left men and elves, for the most part, to their own devices in order to protect that sanctuary on the edge of the world. Though they did come back to put him in his place.
So this may not be the best example for an involved D&D pantheon. Gods who are invested in the day-to-day of your campaign setting.
Right. Although I do feel that this is kind of the system that I am drawn to.
For me, I've mentioned before in previous episodes that I love the game Divinity: The Original Sin 2. And they have a very short list of just 7 deities in their pantheon. 8 if you count the villainous, dark, godlike entity.
Yeah, can't forget them.
They have basically one deity per player race. They have the human god, they have the dwarf god, the elf god, the lizard god, the orc god, the imp/goblin god, and the wizard god, the goddess of magic. And they called it done after that. And they actually, through the narrative of that game, they make each of these gods personally important to the characters, not only by actually parading them past you at various points of the game, by having their spirits inhabit you. Technically, they're hiding within your body, but neither here nor there. But by having you take refuge at a shrine of Amadia before you've escaped the first area. By having you interact with those who are devout followers of their particular faiths. And they give them, importantly, a lot of personality. Tyrsindelius, the god of the Elves, is, you probably guessed, extremely aloof, somewhat racist. They're all a little bit racist. They all think their race is the best race and everybody else is doing it wrong. But very obsessed with the blood of the elves, the purity of it and the maintaining of it and the preservation of their lives and spirits. As very much opposed by Rallic, who is the god of the humans, who is very brash and in your face and aggressive. And even though he has this lordly demeanor, he's got this lordly demeanor with a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, you keep telling me I should check out those games. I guess I need to at some point.
Oh, yeah.
I just know how much of a time commitment they would be for, dad of 3.
But I was formally recommending create a god for every cleric domain. And Divinity went with create a god for every race that is actually in your campaign setting. Before that, when I first started my original campaign, I created a god for each pole on the alignment chart. Law, neutral, chaos. I'm a huge fan of keeping those numbers down and theming them in some way so that you can tell where you should start and when you're done.
I agree. Giving your players something to kind of associate with each of the gods, I think, is very helpful. Obviously, the domains will do that somewhat, but, the domains can be as broad or as narrow as you want them to be. But giving them something like, this is the god of law, neutrality, and chaos, or good, neutral, evil. designating gods into those categories, I think, is helpful, or designating sets of gods into those categories, still very useful. Because even if they can't remember, the name or the domain, they're like, oh yeah, that's one of the good guys.
Now, if you want to go beyond plus ultra and put a little extra
and here you are getting on to me for playing the anime card every week.
I've been rewatching My Hero. It's good. But if you want to put in a little extra work and go that extra mile with your Pantheon and get away from that short list, you can really leave an impression with a somewhat longer but still manageable list of gods. And I think we both have a great example of this in world building.
Right. One of my very first video games that I ever played growing up, outside of like Jumpstart 3rd grade and Pajama Sam and things like that, my first quote-unquote adult video game was Elder Scrolls Oblivion. And I remember walking into the Imperial City and heading to the Temple of the Nine Divines, and I remember to this day virtually every quest that I was sent on for the Daedric Princes in both Oblivion and Skyrim. In the Elder Scrolls, you have the Nine Divines, which are the reigning powers of the world that are accepted as the primary deities throughout most of the continent.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, you'll find a civilization that wants to drop one or two off the list. But
praise Talos.
Careful what you say. Those words might get you killed. At any rate, there are the Nine Divines, who are worshipped throughout the majority of the continent, and then there are also the Daedric Princes. Now, the Daedric Princes are arguably less powerful than the Nine Divines, and they are...
but much more interesting.
And they are locked away, in theory, on their own separate planes of oblivion, but they are actually very involved with the storylines that take place across those games as their influence seeps into the realm of Cyrodiil.
Right, and I remember just wandering down the road, and a talking dog meets me on the road, leads me back to this hidden shrine to Clavicus Vile, tells me to go and get a weapon for him. The interaction with Clavicus and Barbas was one of the more memorable moments of my first Skyrim playthrough for me. And it involves who is tantamount to a lesser deity or an archdevil.
I briefly forgot that Nocturnal was one of the Daedric Princes, but man, Nocturnal's got a huge storyline and is obviously very involved with life on Tamriel.
Mm-hmm.
The Daedric Princes kind of seem to resent being locked away in Oblivion and are actively trying to claw their way back in, some more subtly than others.
Yeah, Mehrunes Dagon, not very subtle.
Yeah, their quests and their interactions with the Dragonborn and the hero of Kvatch are always just super memorable. Like, I wager that the most memorable parts of both of those games for you are your interactions with Sheogorath, just knowing you.
Sheogorath and Sanguine, both. I would be surprised if they weren't most everyone's most memorable moments of that game.
Right.
Just going on a drunken bender and piecing your night together across all of Skyrim, or bamfing into the Shattered Isles to face Sheogorath in a series of peculiar contests. I mean, those are great. That's awesome D&D right there.
Right. Even in Elder Scrolls Online, they get really good. Anyway, I digress. We're getting a little bit off topic. What I want to bring into this is that the Elder Scrolls has the Nine Divines, which are a very established religion of 9 extremely powerful deities.
Right.
And then they also have the Daedric Princes, which are 17, let's call them less well-received recipients of worship that used to be fairly commonplace until the Nine Divines themselves drove them out, and by extension, the followers of their religion were driven out by the followers of the Nine Divines.
Right, and I really like that. The Nine Divines gives you your short list. The guys that everybody across all of Skyrim at least knows their names and gives to them the honor they are due in their particular realm, in their particular area of expertise. Whether they might be a priest or a particular devout of a particular entity, they know these guys. These guys roll off the tongue. They are in the corners of everyone's mind at all times. And then you have the Daedric Princes, which in my campaign settings would be tantamount to lesser deities or demigods. Guys who are minor leaguers, right? Like they're not in the big leagues just yet, but
Shh, they'll hear you.
but they've gone pro, and nobody below them can touch their level of skill and power in the areas with which they are associated. And they're a larger list, and the ones that are important to the story that you're telling come up, and they're not all bad.
Yeah, and that's the point that I was going to make, is at face value, the Nine Divines are good, and the Daedric Princes are bad. And I feel like that's what every good child in Tamriel grows up learning. But once you actually get to interact with them, or once you meet their followers, you realize that, no, some of these were just driven out by worshippers of the Nine Divines. Nocturnal has a place in the world. She provides a service. So does Azura. Sheogorath, not so much. Mehrunes Dagon is an implement of wanton destruction. So they're varied. There are areas of gray. There are things that are presented to you at the inception of your playthrough of the Elder Scrolls, or potentially your campaign, which are presented to you as something to be avoided, but which might not necessarily have to be. That gives you a little bit of wiggle room, and that gives your campaign some depth. In my opinion, at least. Anything else that you want to say about these pantheons before we start talking about yours?
Oh, no, let's get to mine.
Okay.
That's great. I'm more of an expert on that.
Right, so you built a world that has originally just 3 gods, one of law, one of chaos, and one of neutrality, but then it evolved. So what does your current pantheon look like, and how did you design it, and why did you do it that way?
Yeah, so my campaign did start off with those 3. We're up to 17 in my major deities list now, which is a little longer than rolls off the tongue, as I've been saying before, but it has grown over several campaigns as needs arose to have major deities responsible for different things, and as I identified holes in my pantheon, which I strongly recommend other people do. If you're intimidated by the thought of making a pantheon, start small. Start with what is manageable. Start with what is useful. And then, as time goes on, introduce more. We started with Jolin, my god of law, that every paladin in my games likes to be a paladin of.
Right.
We started with Faves.
For the most justice.
Yes. Maximum over justice. Faves, who is my capricious god of chaos, he's definitely the monkey wrench in the Pantheon. He's not necessarily evil, he's not necessarily good, he just likes to press the buttons and see the wheels turn. He likes to break things and see what happens to them.
Right, because you didn't make a good and an evil god, you made a law and a chaos god.
Right. And then Morrow somewhere in the middle, just trying to keep law and chaos from clashing and destroying one another. And kind of, as I mentioned before, the peacemaker, making sure that they can get along and keep this weird world turning.
Right.
Through the events of my first campaign, those were the only 3 gods I had. But the premise of my first campaign was collecting discarded elements of power scattered throughout my world that the gods themselves had left behind, to the point where Jolin, Morrow, and Faves' power had waned. They had expended too much of their power, and it had kindly materialized into items that my player characters went around and collected for themselves. And eventually, one of them, canonically, ascended to divinity and made themselves the 4th god. And technically the most powerful one, because they had all of the power of the 3 that was no longer used by them. That act of ascension opened the floodgates for other mortals to ascend in my campaign setting as the needs of my campaign world grew. Jolin, Morrow, and Faves are still out there and kicking. The standard for divine power has greatly decreased since the world-creating days of Jolin, Morrow, and Faves, no individual or even triumvirate of gods could create a whole new world at this stage in my campaign's history. But any individual one of these 17 could destroy it beyond recognition, if not for the prevention of the others.
Makes sense.
You asked how I kind of organized them.
Oh, I can see how you've organized them, yeah. You actually,
yeah.
You have an Excel spreadsheet which has them all categorized based on their name, their domains, their attributes, the things they like, the things they don't. You have them broken down into the good gods, the neutral gods, and the evil gods. And then you also have them broken down by major gods and minor gods.
Yeah, I stole that pretty much wholesale from our uncle, who made a similar spreadsheet for his own Pantheon that I said, that's cool, I'll steal that. And I deleted everything from his spreadsheet and just filled in the blanks myself with my stuff. When I went from Pathfinder to 5th edition, 5th edition cares a lot about alignment. Not so much maybe as previous editions have, but maybe more so than it should. I went from 3 to 9 initially, and I made aspects or children of Jolin, Morrow, and Faves that fit into the other alignments. Jolin I scooched up to lawful good.
Mm-hmm.
Faves I scooched him over to chaotic good, and Morrow was my true neutral goddess. And then I started filling in the other blanks. I needed a neutral good, so Jolin has a wife named Egress. That's my neutral good goddess. I made a lawful neutral god, Damus, god of wealth and hard-earned rewards, a god that the dwarves in my setting very much relate to. And that's something that I intentionally shied away from, is unlike the example I gave earlier with Divinity, the Original Sin 2, that I was lauding that they made a god for each of the races. I wanted to have cultural gods and geographical gods and conceptual gods, not divide things on race lines. So none of my gods are particularly associated with any player character race in Dungeons & Dragons, or even any of the monster races. But certain aspects of them resonate with different cultures and with different races more so than others. So much so that they will be depicted as being members of these races when paintings or sculptures or icons of them are created. The gods are not constrained by our definitions of form or gender or identity.
Right.
But we as the worshippers tend to translate them into images that we can understand. The Egyptians did that a lot. Right, putting snake heads, crocodile heads, and bird heads on basically human forms because those were images they understood. And that is how they worshipped them and how they represented them and depict them in their culture.
Well, yeah, and if you claim anything as your own, you begin to, associate it with yourself. So it would make sense to say, if I am a human and my civilization started to worship Moradin, my perception of Moradin might, over time, start to look more human, despite the fact that he's classically depicted as a dwarf.
Yeah, along those lines. So, in my Excel document, in my spreadsheet, I have how each god is typically portrayed in their culture. Jolin created dragons. Those were one of his creations. So, he absolutely does not and cannot look like a dragon, but the conception of him by his primary worshippers, who were dragons and dragonborn back in the day, who brought worship of him to other races, is that of a golden dragon. And so that is how Jolin is understood by people in the cultures of my campaign setting.
On the other hand, you could have a god who's like, hey, write what you know, and who does make a race after their own image.
Privately, I think Faves did that with satyrs in my world. He is responsible for the Feywild plane and all of the Fey creatures that dwell therein, a famously chaotic sliver of the multiverse.
Mm-hmm.
And he populated it with things that made him happy, and the things that make Faves happiest is himself and his own capricious whims. And he made this particularly capricious race in his likeness, or in his idealized likeness.
So you mentioned the different gods in your world, and you have a distinction here that we've referenced before about major gods and minor gods. Let's talk a little bit about the variations in power, like the discrepancy that exists there between the major gods and the minor gods, and how relevant that might be to players or their characters in your campaign.
Right. So Dungeons and Dragons has this concept tied into it that mortal worship empowers divine beings.
Mm-hmm.
The more worship that you receive and the more fervent it is, the more power the deity can wield. So much so that the fanatical devotion and imagination of the Kuatoa race in the Underdark, they basically dreamt up this god named Lipdulpulp or something similar, this fish god,
Yeah.
and actually made it a thing. They willed it into existence with their unified faith and worship in canonical Dungeons and Dragons lore. So, the difference in power between one god and the next typically is quantified by their popularity, in a way. The more worshippers you have, the more fashionable it is to worship you, the more that your name is invoked, the more power you can wield. Other than the big three, Jolin, Maro, and Faves, who've put in the time to be major deities, the rest of the major deities in my pantheon are just the dream team.
Gotcha. Yeah. After the OG3, you have everyone else.
Pretty much. And then below my top 17, the little lesser deities, like Ornette, is the god of this group of people in Blackreach called the Silversworn, who everybody hates in every game that I run. And rightly so, they're jerks. But Ornette is depicted as this sickly, wayfish little infant god because nobody worships him. But his very few worshippers worship him with fanatic, insane zeal, to the point where they are able to call upon Ornette for clerical and divine magic.
Right, because he still obviously has enough devotion to be considered a god.
Right, though it is so little that he doesn't enter into the discussion when we're talking about what gods can do. Empowering his faithful is pretty much the extent of his divine power.
So when you differentiate between the minor gods and the major gods, how involved are they in each group with the day-to-day life of mortals?
So I run my gods like people a good bit. They have wants, they have desires, they have goals, and they have a to-do list, and for some gods that list is longer than others. And the major deities are very much big picture, whereas my lesser deities are much more personal and intimate with their followers. Not the least of which, among the reasons why, is because they want to become major deities. And having that close connection with their followers will strengthen that relationship and have them proselytize the people in their immediate surroundings and grow their power. Critical Role Campaign 2 did this really well with the Traveler, where he was personally at Jester's beck and call, even though his divinity is questionable at best.
Right, because originally she was his only worshiper, and he was, for all intents and purposes, really more of a warlock. But as he went on to provide...
She was.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. She was more of a warlock, and he was more of her patron than a cleric deity sort of situation. But as he underwent that same process with effective warlock after effective warlock, they began to spread the word about him until he started to accrue followers for whom he had no existing relationship, and yet he still had their devotion and their adoration, and he was becoming dangerously close to a facsimilation of divinity.
Which he did not handle well. But that is how I view the lesser deities. They are very powerful, and on a small scale, they are as powerful as a major deity on a small scale. But they need that worship. They need that extra step to take it to the next level. And it's kind of a boys' club in a way, by which I mean to say major deities are pretty happy with the list of major deities that are going on already. And they don't want anyone else getting into the club without their say-so, and are likely to go out of their way to try and keep anybody else from climbing that ladder, and may even go out of their way to try and take someone who's currently on their level and knock them down a few pegs. Because the more polluted that major deity list gets, the more the portfolios become divided.
Right, and the harder it is for anyone else to ascend.
Right, so, I mean, you think about...
D&D should not have gatekeepers, but your campaign settings divinities does.
Right.
You must be at least this cool to get past us.
Because imagine Thor, the god of lightning and thunder and storms and the rain and brave combat and passage over the seas. He's got a wide portfolio. But then if a god of safe travels comes along, does that include voyages over the sea? Does it not?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that some people who were worshipping Thor will be lured away to this other deity? Maybe. Is Thor worried about that? Probably. And what does that do for your story? How does that affect your campaign setting? Does it matter to your player characters? If it does, explore that.
Right. It is a very interesting system to have their power tied to the quantity of worship that they receive in this game. And that might make him worried about this ongoing feud he has with the god of something completely unrelated, like the forests.
Yeah.
Because you're right, Thor might be concerned that he's losing 10% of the people who were hopping onto boats praying to him.
Guys, we're down from last quarter.
You know, if this upstart starts taking away some of his seafaring folk, then he might not be able to contend with Forest Guy, because that means he directly becomes 10% less powerful.
Yeah, and, you know, your campaign setting doesn't have to follow that rule. Some gods should just be gods, and their power should not be able to be affected by the lives and whims of mortals. I think it adds an interesting little flavor to it, but I could absolutely see a good dungeon master just leaving that part out. Sorry, I got a little derailed. But to answer your question, the differences between the major and the minor deities. Broad strokes, major deities have broad portfolios and a significant amount of power to the point where they could create or destroy things on a large scale. Not universes, not planes, maybe demi-planes, land masses, cities, and the like. Lesser deities have small portfolios. They're generally very specific in their area of concern or expertise. They are very powerful on a small scale, probably starting from a smaller demi-plane to accruing followers and creating miracles and accruing small forces of lower celestials. Like maybe they don't have a solar, but they have several devas in their employ.
Mm-hmm.
It's a vague distinction, but that's kind of where I'm putting the line in my head, is they have fewer resources and smaller miracles that they can bring to bear.
You know, based on something that you just said, I have a new headcanon for D&D.
Oh, shoot. That's cool.
That Bardic inspiration is actually just one person believing in you and giving you a tiny little potential miracle that you can use to do something you otherwise couldn't.
Ha! That's really cute.
Isn't it, though? I know, it's so sappy.
I actually really like that.
Yep, that's my new headcanon. Whenever I do a game, then if I have a bard, that's what I'll tell them it is.
If I'm in it, you'll have a bard.
I need to think very seriously about that. For a lot of reasons.
Now, what was the question you asked me? I'm sorry.
Okay, this is an opinion piece. Audience, be prepared. I'm just asking Rob's opinion. You know, this is not necessarily how you should do it.
Because you know Rob, that guy and his ideas.
You mentioned before the quote-unquote humanity, the fallibility of the gods in a campaign setting. Let's say how fallible, how quote-unquote human, and how honestly petty are the gods in your campaign.
Depending on who you are talking about, which one of them, very little to very, very, very.
Do you draw that line along like law and chaos?
To a certain extent, I do, actually. No, actually, I take that back. My gods are pretty human in terms of their cares, their wants, desires. They have ideals and bonds and flaws just like player characters and villains do, although they seem to come up a lot less often.
You give those to everything in your campaigns, don't you?
Anything that has a personality needs these things. Let's take Rom. Rom is my lawful evil deity. He is the lord of the hells and the general of all of the demon armies. Rom is very driven, and he is very ambitious. Rom wishes that he was the only god, which is not something that every god in my pantheon wants. Rom has a plan to make that happen, and it's very much a long-term goal that he has been working towards, and will continue to work towards for a very long time. Maybe the campaigns that I run will never explore his end game. But his flaw is that he believes himself infallible, that he is the strongest and the smartest individual that has ever existed, and that is why he believes he deserves to be the only deity out there, is that he will do the best job of it, and he doesn't need the help or the competition. His lieutenant, Cray, is a manipulative SOB. He is a dark god of lies and whispers, subterfuge, and backstabbery. He's kind of the Loki in my campaign setting. And Rom is destined to fail in his pursuits if he continues to take Cray for granted. Because Cray and his humbler goal of deposing Rom is much more manageable, and he is much better equipped to make it happen. So I like gods like Rom and Cray and Zeus, who can't keep it in his pants and keeps running off from his duties on Mount Olympus to go have a good time, and keeps cheating on Hera, who is upset with him because her husband keeps running off and leaving her with all of these duties, and she feels underappreciated.
So she does all this stuff to get back at him because, she feels betrayed.
There's actually a Netflix series called Blood of Zeus. Have you watched that
I have
yet?
not watched it. No spoilers.
It's very similar in style to the Castlevania series, which makes me like it even more. But it deals with the interpersonal relationships between the Greek gods in a very satisfying way. So does the roguelike Hades, which I've been playing way too much of lately when I should really be editing podcasts.
If we're behind, you know why.
Sorry. But it gives incredible personalities to Hypnos and Thanatos and Hades and Persephone and Nyx and Charon that humanize them in entertaining ways and give them a lot of personality. You can play your gods as unfeeling masters of the universe, or you can play them as people with way too much power. And I think it's clear which I think is more narratively interesting.
Right. You prefer the Greek gods who can't keep it in their pants and the Norse gods who are
constantly fighting,
constantly interacting with mortals,
well,
messing with them.
I'm writing a book on that, actually.
I think that we have talked a lot today about different pantheons, things that you should definitely take into account when creating them, things that might make it easier and less intimidating for you, and hopefully some of this will be helpful whenever you get to designing that next setting.
Yeah, I don't know if we've given too much actionable advice on how to use them, as much as like presenting the different options that you might have.
I think that if we caution you against a few things that are going to waste a lot of your time, then, it's a worthwhile point to make.
Just in summary, what are the big takeaways from this for you? Because I know you're playing around with a new campaign setting in your head.
D&D assumes that you're going to be having gods. So the default for designing a campaign setting should involve gods. You need at least one. One is fine. The more you make, the more specific and the more dynamic you can make it. Dividing it up will make it, I hesitate to say easier. Dividing it up will allow you to engage different characters and different story arcs in very specific ways. If you do divide up your Pantheon into a polytheistic system, which again, I believe D&D assumes that you will, then you want to be clear about the domains. This is the god of this is the god of that, whether it be a race, an alignment, or a particular aspect of life.
And importantly, give yourself a clear point where you can say, I'm done with this. Give yourself a finish line before you start. It's fine to add to it after, but set yourself a goal and achieve it. Something manageable.
I do think that you should focus on, let's call them major gods, and for the sake of narrative convenience later on, the longer you maintain your setting, maybe leave yourself open to the option of adding in minor gods or demigods later on.
Especially with the input of the people who will actually be interacting with your setting.
Right.
Players may have needs that you were not prepared for, or that wouldn't have even occurred to you.
Definitely. And you should also, at some point in this process, take the time to consider how involved that god or those gods will be in your world, how quote-unquote human they will be. You should also take into consideration how powerful they will be. Will it be a single, fully omnipotent, omniscient god, or will they be more limited than that? And if more limited, which probably they will be, how much more limited? If you have a bunch of gods with a bunch of different domains, there is the thought that these aren't going to overlap too much.
And if you do limit their power in some way, are some gods more powerful than other gods? And does that affect any relationship that they might have with one another, or that their followers might have with one another?
Let's take another example from the Greek pantheon. Zeus decides, hey, I don't like this guy. Screw him in particular. I want him dead. So he kills him. That soul goes to Hades. What does Hades do with him? Hades maintains the option to just flip that guy back topside. Let him walk right back out. Bar him entrance into Hades. There's a little bit of overlap there. Can Zeus kill a guy? Yes. Can Zeus decide that that soul goes to the underworld? No. There will most likely be some sort of limitation placed upon your deities, and you should probably decide where to draw those lines. Finally, make it simple for your players. I believe that it would be better as a player who is starting in your campaign setting to understand these are the good gods, these are the bad gods. Yes, it can be more morally gray than that, but that sort of thing will help them. If you say this is the law god, this is the chaos god, that helps. If you say these are the current gods in the major accepted religion in this country that you're playing in, and these are the guys who are worshipped in cult basements and forests and caves and things, that is going to stick as well.
And if you're having trouble coming up with names for your gods and goddesses that populate your pantheon, like we said in the villains episode, I'm a big fan of titles. The Smiling One, He Who Watches, the Huntress, the Earth Mother. These things will not only be descriptive and help your characters more easily identify what they are responsible for, but your players will be more likely to remember them and use them during roleplay.
Right. Sheogorath is kind of a mouthful the first time that you play Oblivion, but the Mad God sticks around.
The Mad God. Ah, man. Sheogorath is fun.
Anyway, and then finally, I think you should decide how directly they're going to be involved in your campaign and the world. And did that change at some point? Again, I enjoy systems that have undergone some change at some point in the past. Perhaps they used to be very involved and now they're not, a la Lord of the Rings. Maybe I really like Critical Role's concept of the Divine Gate that Matt Mercer came up with, how the gods all used to interact with the world extremely directly, but then the betrayer gods got out of hand and the divines had to use the majority of their power to create the Divine Gate and keep the betrayer gods from interfering with the prime material plane. So now you have no gods that truly interact personally on the prime material plane anymore, because some of them are clawing their way to get through the gate, and all of the others that remain have invested the majority of their energy to just keeping them out.
That was something I was going to mention when you mentioned how involved do you want the gods to be in your world. Do they act autonomously? Do they interfere personally and directly with the world? Or is it through their followers? Divine Gate is a great example. In my campaign setting, the reason that Jolin, Morrow, and Faves lost their exclusivity as gods is because every time they interacted personally and directly with the world, they either really damaged it in some way, some irreparable way, so that the world is now more imperfect than it was at its creation, or that they used up too much power and left something behind. And so now, all of the gods have reached an accord with one another that they're not going to do that anymore. Their jobs are on the line if they interfere directly, because the other gods will say, "What are you doing to this thing we made? We're trying to keep this intact. You get it together, man. You are getting demoted right now."
Right.
So they've all reached this accord that they will only act through their faithful. They will only intervene indirectly. Of course, that accord is being broken, and by some of the subtler gods, and some of the less subtle ones. That's kind of what necessitated the existence of the Divine Champion, who's dead.
There you go.
But, yeah, deciding where the gods stand on direct versus indirect involvement, as you said, can really change the tone of a game.
And in addition to deciding, how much power the gods have, you should also think about where is this coming from. Again, the primary D&D assumption is that they are gaining this power from their followers, but you could use a different system as well. I actually kind of like the way that Dark Souls did it. There's a couple of major deities that found a very limited number of quote-unquote souls out in the dark voids before time really existed. And these entities found the souls, and that gave them a colossal amount of power. And then they had the ability to segment and break apart their souls and bequeath it to other peoples beneath them. They became immortal, and the people that they gave their souls to became immortal, and the power broke down a little bit more every time they passed it on. But you have a broad kind of spectrum of divinity in the Dark Souls games based on how many times that soul got broke up.
That is very interesting. I didn't really think about it until you started saying that. Divinity was a tangible, attainable, misplaceable, losable, stealable thing in the Dark Souls world.
Yeah, you could pick it up and crush it in your hand and absorb it, and when you died, it rose up from your body for the next guy to walk up and grab.
That's very interesting. I shouldn't ask that question because I've kind of answered that by the campaigns that I've run before.
Well, you ran a game called The Shards of Divinity or something like that, and it had literal things that you could walk around and pick up, and if you got all of them, then you became a god. And Dark Souls is a little bit like that. The Pantheon is fluid because if you kill one of these guys and you take their quote-unquote soul, you do that enough times, you're on the list. That's pretty much the premise of Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3 is the original Pantheon has been killed and their souls have been re-picked up by other creatures. It's kind of fun to try to trace, okay, so who got which soul by the time Dark Souls 3 comes around. Mm-hmm. But it is very much that way.
Food for thought. I'm going to have fun thinking about Dark Souls later and more ways to play, because some of my favorite ideas in Dungeons & Dragons play with divinity, and kind of the D&D dream is to ascend, to canonize your player character in the pantheon of the campaign setting.
And that's what you do for the people who play in your campaign setting.
Kind of. At least lately.
I also think that it's pretty neat when you have multiple pantheons who are vying for power, a la the Nine Divines versus the Daedric Princes, or in real-world pantheons, the Titans versus the Olympians. The Titans were actually the ones that created the world, and then the Olympians came by, defeated and caged up the Titans, and now they're the ones that preside over it.
The Greek and Roman concepts of their pantheons were so stinking similar. I always liked the idea of them having to duke it out to see who got to stick around.
I think that is hopefully some food for thought.
Maybe too much.
It is certainly food for thought for me as I go through the beginning stages of designing my upcoming campaign setting.
Yeah.
So thanks for humoring us as we go through what may have been educational for you or what may have just been a mental exercise for us.
This kind of stuff is really fun for me to talk about. I hope it's fun to listen to, because world building is kind of my passion when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, and it's the reason why I run, and why I so rarely run boxed campaigns or pre-written settings. And when it comes to world building, the builders of your world, your gods, are a great place to start. As I said before, I have a document handwritten in an old legal pad describing every aspect of how each individual race and magic item and land in my world came to be at the dawn of creation. Like, that's the fun stuff for me. That's the juice.
And I should definitely say, you should feel free to start small. You do not have to get that in-depth. We
don't necessarily be like me.
We do this sort of thing because we enjoy it. You can start a campaign with just a town, although I would argue, maybe a town and a god would probably be good. But I do think that when you're thinking of like the creation mythos for your world, when you get ready to do that, that is definitely the time you want to start thinking about the players in that story.
If there's any interest out there on the internet of how to come up with a creation myth, I'd be more than happy to talk about my process for that at a later time.
Or anytime, really. If you want to come onto our Discord and ask us a couple questions about it, we would be more than happy to answer them there.
I'll show you pictures of my legal pad.
And if this episode was not entirely educational, there are places that you can find some stuff that we've put out that is. For instance, Rob, you are still a regular contributor on Dungeon Feed, is that right?
Yeah, Misty Mountain Gaming publishes my articles from time to time. My small, humble contributions to Dungeons & Dragons philosophy, tips and tricks that I've learned over my years playing this game. I also have written a adventure, and I'm in the process of writing a second one and a much larger book for them that can be found on Misty Mountain Gaming's website in their online shop.
And of course, you can always keep tuning back in here every week or two for another dose of Bardic Twinspiration.
So, until that next episode airs, once again, I'm Rob.
And I'm Steven.
And we'll see you next episode.
Bye! The outro music you're listening to right now is called Mega Epic, and the intro music is called Super Epic. Both were composed by the wonderfully talented Alexander Nakarada and utilized under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of his music at serpentsoundstudios.com. If you enjoyed our content, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on your listening app of choice. To keep up with us on social media, look us up on facebook.com/Bardic Twinspiration and on Twitter @BTwinspiration. Want to interact with us directly? Come join our Discord. After all, who are we if not people who are willing to roll the dice on making some new friends? Links in the description. Come check it out. The Greek gods who can't keep it in their pants, and the Norse gods who are
constantly fighting,
interacting with mortals, messing with them. Man, Norse gods couldn't keep it in their pants either. Some of them were not even picky about those things being vaguely humanoid. Actually, I guess, wasn't it Zeus with swans and Loki with horses? Anyway.
That's how Sleipnir came to be. I'll tell you about that later.
Some other time.